First of all, I wanted to thank the organizers for having invited me to talk about the territory, the rural area, as we currently call it. Well, during my talk, I will try to bring about a certain number of ideas, reflections and concerns about nearly 50 years of thoughts. Some of these ideas have reached the narrative of what we talk when we talk about ruralism and the process of the opposition of rural-urban areas, and that is very much present in the town planning and the urban planning. Others are not quite accepted in the mainstream idea of ruralism and is still recalling us about the resistance to change and the resistance to new things, and later on I will dwell upon it. First of all, I wanted to talk about this mainstream, and 50 years ago I used a certain number of information that came from collections of local reports and the great challenges of an encounter that was the great challenges we had to face. The rural term was used back in the 50s, and it replaced the term land worker or farmer, and they talked about a certain number of challenges, world and global challenges, and other challenges were related to the developing countries and others for the developed countries. We could still nowadays say the same, because all of that we saw that was existing in last century is still an issue today, and I'm sure that a lot has been said about that, both about the great challenges and also the new topics that weren't a reality 50 years ago, but have become a reality today. Environmental issues, for example, the large companies in the planet are green, everything is green, and the trend that takes us back to the land, or what we talked about, the soft technologies that have been multiplying lately. But this is what is in the mainstream, as I've said many times. So I couldn't repeat myself, and I couldn't repeat these issues. So I will talk about new topics, although they're related to traditional terms. During my talk, I will use a certain number of terms: globality and telematic society, and the global term is going to refer to the opportunities in our societies currently, the advanced societies, and quite wealthy society where we talk about these topics we are addressing during these 3 days. I will start by telematics, talking about telematics and the global world and the rurality, which is not a way of being but more a space where to live. And that's why I don't like to use rural area but more rurality, which is related to a space. A telematic society does not need a presentation. We know how it is, we know what is society, and if we look at and we search telematic in Google, we know that there are much more registers than today, and we are doomed to use the term globalization. This wasn't the case a certain number of years ago, but when we look for globalization, we still find a lot of entries. In the 70s, last century, we came up with a lot of new definitions that enables us to describe a society that was transforming itself and less was like the industrial society or the society we know today, and the one known by Saint-Simon at the beginning of the 19th century. It was atomic. These they were going to solve everything, and this post-industrial society, society of information, and technotronic society, and other societies that were shared by many authors. The society of information, the post-industrial society, used by many authors that have been used many times, and other societies that shared authors. There was an author that used very much this terminology, James Martin, one of the experts in informatics, engineer, and who had a great influence in the 20th century. He wrote many books about the subject and created many companies, and he is also the author of what I have always considered, because these kind of works have to be reread. We are rereading Marx, for example, to see how realistic were Marx's thoughts and approaches, and Toffler and other authors have to be reread to see how was the model of society. And Martin's and Toffler's thoughts are the ones more adapted to these emerging societies. These are maybe the less used in the academician world or in the mainstream. In fact, Martin was presented as the media of those times as a fortune teller, but it was a physician, an expert in informatics and in computer science, but a lot of his previsions have become reality, and even beyond reality, because some of his predictions did not forecast such results. In his books, he used titles such as Computerized Society in the 70s, Cable Society, that inspired one of the most famous magazine, Wired, that was inspired in Martin's works, and also In a second edition of the World Society, the term of telematic society. That was a term that adjusted to the works published during those times, depending on the communication amongst computers. The term was taken from French reports that was asked to two high civil servants, and they based upon the Saint-Simon and Conte thoughts to civil servants Simon, Nora and Alan Mink, that was published in 1978. Nora and Mink introduced what they called a barbarism, but the French have been talking about this concept, and they define telematics as the combination of the computer science and the media science and the telecommunications that enables the computers to communicate among themselves or with human beings. So telematics in this telematic society relies upon a third pillar that wasn't addressed by Nora and Mink, but in the work of James Martin is very much present. The third pillar is optics. That are the three great pillars that are going to uphold this society. I'm a sociology teacher, and I say always that telematics change all the rules, and many changes have taken place in our daily lives, in the human and animal life. And I also try to explain in my classes what concerns us, the noospheric dream of Chardin, of the minds of the interconnected planet, is a reality in the telematic society, because the subject underlying all of that is not the information, but we talk about the society of information, despite the fact that we have been talking about this information society. Of course, we are dealing with a great deal of information, and the management of information is a key issue in all societies. It has been like that for many years already. There is nothing new in that, but the new aspect is the capacity of transmitting all that instantly to hold the planet. It is the capacity to connect humans and machines, not only to disseminate those data, but to do things, open and close big doors, and according to the satellites, for example, to open gates, or to have a camera connected to control the humidity in a cornfield, for example. It is done thanks to telematics. The society of information, and those who talk about this society of information, they say that the major activity is about sharing and getting information, but this is not true really, because in the telematic society the main activity is not information, it is the there's activities that we keep doing since quite a lot of time to feed ourselves, to reproduce ourselves with a great amount of pleasure, if possible. And it is what they did, our ancestors, 1 million years ago. But what we do, we have been doing it according to certain production modes that are going to give privileges to some people more than others, and according to sophisticated methods, since Neolithic to telematic society. So information is only another ingredient that is flowing through the fiber optics or the copper cable. And it's still the case in many small towns and villages currently with the copper cable. I had to move myself to attend this Zoom meeting because of that. And before we had paper and everything was written on paper. The agricultural minister, health ministers just sent some papers to the farmers, and it was done through paper and later on through cable. And the new item and the specificity of our society currently is the capacity to overcome the space and time barrier. The financial speculators know very well what are those time barriers, or the rewriting we are doing currently of the history. It is another way to overcome these barriers. So thanks to these new technologies of processing and dissemination of information. And when overcoming this, we get to the key of the issue that we're dealing. Once introduced the term telematic society, we can talk about this new term, rurality. Why do I resist to use the word rural areas or rural zones? Everybody used that term, but not everybody is using this term. If I am forced to use a term that relates to rural, I prefer to use land, countryside. These rural areas are not as they were in the past. That's why I prefer to use other terms. These transformations I am talking about have their consequences on the territory in many aspects. I talk about rurality as a different space that differentiates itself from the rural areas. The rural area is a way of being. Rural areas are a way of being that limits the character of individuals. Rurality is a space where to live. Since quite a lot of years, I should say, I'm getting older, I try to point at the idea of the difference between rural and urban areas. The urban areas are subject to town planning. It was difficult to establish this difference, and soon I was to understand why, because the analysis we done in the 80s or 90s in many places, and also the new town planning project we had, we saw thanks to Henri Lefebvre and through Mario Badilla, we saw a process of urbanization of the countryside. It was a loss it was seen as a loss, and it was seen as a negative impact. When we talked about urbanization of countryside, we talked about getting modern and changing the rural world. We were talking about adding up cultural processes. My first sociological work. I was a journalist in those days. This work was published, and it analyzes the loss of identity of a small village in Zaragoza that became, in the 70s, a town very close to a thermal plant. And it is today a town of 1,000 of inhabitants, but it had much more inhabitants, 7,000 inhabitants. That 1,000 of those inhabitants work for this thermal power station. Now this town is cleaner. This thermal power station closed, and now they have a new solar station, and I'm sure they have recuperated a part of the rurality that was lost. I published several works insisting on this idea. The rurality wasn't that what it was in the past. Those who talked about the fit and health products, and they had more and more sophisticated instruments to work in the land, and those ladies that bought the tins instead of having the vegetable tins. So these people coming to these areas, they were no more rurals. They were changing the landscape. What was defined as a rural society wasn't there, in a sense. When talking about these changes in the rural areas, we come about with a certain number of studies and works. I carried out a study in the uses of the rural land near Burgos in Castilla, and also I published work about the non-urbanization of the areas of the Puerto Santa Maria in Alicante region, and I could observe the discourse about rural and urban and the multiplication of uses of what had been in the past a void space. And they were outside the town planning at that time. In Alicante, a study carried out in 1982, it was a continuation of the town planning of these areas that was quite modern. We wanted to know what happened in the countryside nearby. We discovered that this territory was so complex, needing so much urban planning as the city center. This is a quite wide municipality. It was a rural area, of course, but full of things, of activities, of tensions, of urban nature. In this case, using a specific methodology, we first of all discovered quite a lot of settlements of farmers that were covering a quite wide and larger space. But the map started to change with this settlement, and also with the roads, the networks, and it was quite a lot of networks with the water, with the water coming from the Tajo Segura and from several water usage water, and that enables us to have quite good quality farming in this area, although we were lacking a little bit of water. And the irrigation also was important, and there was many extraction activities. There was different stones extracted, and they used to use marble that was extracted there to build the houses, although now these marble and the stones are coming from other areas. Apart from the extraction, there were also the seaweed used to extract salt. But there were many activities surrounding this salt extraction. But when you have a huge network of communication and distribution of goods, we have at the outskirts of the town many activities that could be dangerous, or that these activities might need quite a lot of land. And in the list of those activities, that was quite important in the area of Alicante. This territory also aims at being a nice place where to live for the urban dwellers, and many individuals bought houses there, and they occupied the land. So it was quite clear that talking about a category known as non-urbanizable land, this wasn't not sufficient. It did not care about all the activities, and we also had to look at the different stakeholders that wanted to have this rural territory as we known it before then. So we had looked at many users, and we looked at those places, and there was a clash between our thoughts and the aim of the architects, because outside there was only land to be built, but we soon showed that the space was full of things. In 1982, in Mallorca, took place the first encounter on urban planning, and since then we have evolved, and we have progressed quite a lot towards the current urban planning. And although we not always have the ideal ingredients, but nowadays we approach the territory with this new approach. But back then we did not understood the nature of this land. We needed to understand the nature of this telematic society. Look at what is the opinion of the expert, an architect of that time, that said the distance between the rural and urban area has to be understood. The opposite is to condemn the rural area. This is the discourse of ruralism. We did not understand back then that the rural aspect has to be understood as one ingredient of the city, and not as something that is outside rural areas little by little became urban, and in the need of an urban planning, the different territories called rural, and where the towns are called villages, have become urban through assimilation and the access to technologies and telecommunication infrastructures. So the concept of urban village, this concept, I used it in a book I published with the School of Architecture in Madrid in 1998, when I talked about the old and new functions of the land. And then later on I was going to develop this topic furthermore in this book. This concept stems from many sources, but it is based on two pillars: the ethnopolis and the mesopolis and the ethnosphere, and it is not linked with the concept of urban village or of Norman Freeman. Huge towns and cities that are in the ranking of the global cities, which is a concept that is not very much used, because a city can be up north or down in the south, but it is not important. The simple idea in the framework of the telematic society that enables us to overcome the time barriers, and the towns and cities are going to lose their meaning as specific facts because they interconnect themselves. We are going to define the global town or village as the process where the physical aspects are going to be in all the areas. The city does not exist anymore as a limited space. The social space is bigger, and centrality is only an interrelated telematics among protocentrality that are located in physical spaces. This is very much important because it's colliding with the vision of cities as we know them before. Let's think about what the physical distances mean. They were overcome with the arrival of transportation means that are going to multiply up to the infinite, because in the 19th century societies did not really relate themselves except during the war and with the military service, because then we had to get out of our village. In the past there was no relationship among people, but the rurality started to get in touch with the big towns nearby when they had to go to study, to get shopping, or when they had to go to the doctor. The urban dweller in a village in the 21st century has access to many relationships thanks to the new development. Well, the idea of this global village, I like to use this drawing, which reflects the interconnected planet. This implies the idea that, except for what I mean, the islands of rurality, although they can be quite large, the settlements are interconnected in a way that the outskirts of the town become interconnections. A huge garden, a global garden. We have small towns. We also have the old orchard of Valencia. And as in the old concepts of the free spaces in the city, these are virtual spaces with many activities, very different. So the land planning plays a major role because it seeks the coexistence of different interests, of vested interests that are competing among themselves. So we should consider the territory as the fruit of this planning, not as the nature that we have to protect and safeguard, but more as a space that is a part of the urban, that is very complex and interconnected, and where different stakeholders are competing for the management of this land. We could have different competition. We can have people that come only on Sundays, but then we can have also the competition of those with farmers or secondary residences with farms, for example. So this interpretation of a global town or village has to be related to land and to the territory. Some authors are going to interpret that in terms of a virtuality, where the locations would be built by software and would be interconnected with different logic connections. So we also have the ecology. I'm not talking about virtual cities, but I'm talking about virtual relationship between cities and rural areas, not only of global urbanism that are made up of complex realities. Of course, this model has other implications. The territory is going to be considered as nature and also as an environment that is going to uphold different uses. Of course, here the ingredients are quite different and at different scales. So the urban planning here plays a major role to articulate the coexistence of these different interests. We have to consider the territory as the object of the planning. The territory in this global town is not the countryside and is not nature either. Its capacity of resources goes well beyond that. That's why we are changing in our way of approaching these areas. This is quite complex and it is quite an issue. So I have those axes of survival to talk about the assets of rurality and enable them to survive. We're looking at different investments, plans, or repopulation. If rurality is a space where to live and not a way of life, as was the rurality, it is possible, for example, to face situations where in the outskirts of the city, it is another neighborhood where there should be different initiatives, different dwellers that could compete with the farmers, with the businessmen. There are many possibilities. We also can have cultural exploitations in terms of tourist resources that could collide with the sounds of the countryside and the rooster that is going to sing at 6 in the morning. But these are activities that are essential for the survival of those territories. Many are the possibilities and the opportunities, but this entails often conflicts. There is currently a discussion about a huge project, what we talk about the Yellowstone of Spain, where there is a project aiming at promote the environment, but also tourism, but that is going to collide with local interests. And this is quite a sensible issue. In fact, we have been facing to a real gentrification of the countryside. It is not only present in the town or in the big cities. This is the case, of course, in the Ampurdán in Catalonia, for example, or in Jerte in Extremadura and the Pyrenees. We have many examples of this gentrification. In villages, but not only in secondary residence. We have these people coming to the countryside that do not tolerate those noises in the countryside. And when all is full of shops and flats, in the end we have desertification. And when we end up or we put an end to the noises of the land, but we have other noises, and soon it might become a desert because of the lack of these farmers. I will be talking about the population, but I see Jose Maria that is going to tell me that I'm running out of time. Jose Maria, I still have time. Okay, then I will finish talking about desertification. I've had quite a lot of work these days. I am a teacher, so I had to look at many exams. But I would like to talk about depopulation, the topic of this encounter. I would like first of all to point at the contradiction between the authorities that are sad about the emptied Spain and the depopulation and the existence of young people that have decided to repopulate those empty spaces, not in private spaces, of course, that can be occupied and it doesn't matter, but in places that have been depopulated, in those emptied spaces and villages, to do something that is very difficult. We talked about that 40 years ago, the major risks of going to the countryside, but this time it has been taken to the courts, sadly. So I have to reflect upon that, because we need those people that go to the countryside to repopulate, although it might end in a failure, and it is the case often. But this is case that I like very much. So we do not have to be too worried about the depopulation. Why? Because in Spain we have hundreds of thousands of places that shouldn't have been habitated. Only the hunger in the 16th, 17th century obliged those people to come to those valleys that were populated in those days, in the valleys of La Rioja. Lately I have had the opportunity to talk about the depopulation and the situation in Extremadura. This is one of the regions that is less densely populated in Spain, and the population is the number of inhabitants is diminishing. And in the 60s, 70s, many infrastructures were built, a lot of infrastructures, and the great monuments were built in those times. I think we shouldn't be too much obsessed about that and too much worried. We're not going to have a fleeing of the cities as we thought in the past, as some have mentioned during the health crisis. There's going, of course, there are going to be more people in the outskirts of the city, in the rurality we have, than the people that have fled in the past decennies and the past decades. We mustn't worry about, of course, there is concern about the demography, because demography is the backbone of a region and a country. We need those people. They're a major part of development. As a structural element, these men and these individuals were needed. We had to look at the population, communication, transportation, whatever, to have an idea of its power. A densely populated country was more powerful, and some less populated, for example, as Netherlands, were able to fight back many invasions. Therefore, the changed in 1998, where we have a term that is called yellow danger, where we have a lot of inhabitants, and when we were afraid about that because we saw that China was densely populated. But then when the Western countries become to be aware of the fact that China is so big, and then little by little we come about with a certain number of reflections and thoughts. For example, Kingsley Davis in the 40s introduces the term of the demographic explosion, and it could be a threat for those less densely populated. But we have lived during more than 50 years with great fear to what the biologists talked about, the population bomb. We have to stop growth, but now we are worried about the fact that there is no birth in some territories. Nevertheless, we are very much afraid about a small country like Israel or North Korea than India, that was that had those greatest population. India is now at a standstill, but they do not want to promote birth rate because it is not of no use. So despite its aging population, they close the door to immigration. They do not want migrants. They want to have robots. It is much cheaper to have robots than kids. It is cheaper. It is easier to have more robots than kids, than children, because up to the Industrial Revolution, the population was a factor, and now it is determined. It has been determined by too many factors. For example, the population stock of a territory that was only modified by wars or plagues, or today can be impacted by many factors. A fashion, a trend can have an impact on the birth rate of a country, for example. The religious beliefs, the economy, improvement in transportation means fashion. So it is very difficult to have a demographic forecast. We do not believe in those predictions anymore. In the 90s, we thought that there were going to be a huge birth rate. It is not true anymore. They thought that hundreds of villages were going to disappear in all the regions. But look at all these 3 small villages. And according to the forecast of those days, these villages should have disappeared long ago. But little by little, they just are there. They resist, they survive, and they do not disappear. Why? These little villages are a part now of the huge global town. And I will finish up with that. I'm sure you have been talking about that, but we have to insist on that. If there should be requirements, an important requirement, because we do not have much money, but we have to include all these villages in the urban and global town. They have to be communicated. Without no connection, little can be done, except in the cases who want to be outside the world, those who want to live outside society as we know it. We're not talking about the 5G. The 4G in the network we are using for our telecommunication is going to set aside a huge amount of villages. The 2G is not all over the territory either. When we look at the Spanish map, those who are looking for a house, they're first, I'm sure, looking to the network present there, to Movistar or to any other operator. Sometimes when you look at the map, you don't see this. There is no presence of telecommunication. There are villages with no network at all. And survival is impossible. Survival in this global town without connection, it is impossible. We cannot survive without this communication. We will need to have someone coming to provide us with food and with many other things. There are many things that should be addressed. I'm sure there are many questions. If there is time, I will be happy to answer to your questions. Thank you for your attention.